Amener le projet Bénin Cashew à accompagner la production de ce matériel végétal performant à travers d'abord les acteurs qui sont les pépiniéristes, dont la structuration a été accompagnée, et ensuite maintenant la recherche qui aujourd'hui fait l'objet d'un accompagnement à travers l'installation de 2 sites qui vont abriter les vergers de production de semences polyclonales qui puissent permettre d'atteindre l'objectif d'augmentation de la production de plants d'anacarde.
En termes d'action, Technoserve à travers Bénin Cashew a 3 axes. Le premier axe, c'est augmenter de façon quantitative les arbres mères. Ce que nous appelons arbres mères, c'est ces arbres d'anacarde qui peuvent permettre en réalité d'offrir des greffons aux pépiniéristes afin quand même d'offrir aux producteurs des plants greffés. Le deuxième axe d'intervention, c'est ces semences l'axe qui permet d'installer 2 vergers de production de semences polyclonales, un verger de 12 hectares à Ogui dans la commune de Savé et un verger de 12 hectares à Ina dans la commune de Bembereke. Le troisième axe d'intervention de Bénin Cashew en termes d'appui, c'est le renforcement des capacités. Et à ce titre, Technoserve a pris l'engagement d'accompagner 7 jeunes et cadres au niveau du ministère de l'Agriculture pour les envoyer en formation.
Technoserve nous a appuyés pour un voyage en Tanzanie. Et là, nous avons découvert de très merveilleuses manières de travail, telles que le greffage sur bois mou. Nous avons aussi reçu les techniques de fabrication de bokashi. Le bokashi, c'est un engrais organique. Bénin Cashew Technoserve a financé le voyage des experts d'autres pays qui sont venus nous apprendre cette technique de fabrication de bokashi.
L'Institut national de recherche agricole du Bénin a certaines faiblesses que la coopération avec Technoserve est en train de combler en termes d'infrastructures de conservation de ce matériel, en termes de ressources humaines capables de gérer convenablement ce patrimoine génétique. Nous avons déjà, avec l'appui de Technoserve, identifié des arbres élites performants d'anacardier dont nous allons utiliser les potentiels pour dupliquer et avoir beaucoup d'autres matériels. Nous avons aussi avec Technoserve le contact avec des pays comme la Tanzanie et le Mozambique qui ont de l'expérience en matière de production de cajou. Et donc on pourrait bien les rattraper.
L'importance de l'installation de ce verger est d'augmenter la quantité de matériel végétal de qualité pour permettre aux producteurs d'avoir un rendement plus élevé à l'hectare.
Nous avons aujourd'hui 3 conseillers d'entreprise qui encadrent la cinquantaine de pépiniéristes dûment identifiés, sélectionnés avec l'appui du gouvernement pour que cette production repose sur des techniques managériales, entrepreneuriales qui permettent à ces pépiniéristes de jouer un rôle prépondérant dans l'atteinte de l'objectif de l'augmentation de la production de notre cajou.
Le rôle du pépiniériste, nous sommes les gardiens du matériel végétal, qui est un patrimoine pour notre pays. Donc sans le pépiniériste, le matériel végétal performant vont disparaître. Ce que Bénin Cashew a fait pour moi, permettez-moi de le dire, ils m'ont beaucoup appuyé, surtout la formation des femmes. Donc on a eu à former 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et un homme. Bénin Cashew est comme la levure dans la farine de blé qui fait lever le pain. J'ai pu avoir beaucoup de choses. Je me suis acheté un domaine où je suis en train de construire une maison familiale actuellement. Et à côté, j'ai prévu une pépinière. Avant Bénin Cashew, je produis 5000 plants. Je suis aujourd'hui à au moins 12 000 plants. Je vois un futur radieux devant moi.
contexte actuel de crise sanitaire mondiale liée à la pandémie de la COVID-19, il s'avère fondamental de relever la participation des femmes dans tous les maillons de la production, d'encourager et de renforcer leur leadership et leur résilience pour favoriser leur autonomisation, surtout dans le domaine économique. TechnoServe Bénin et l'Agence territoriale de développement agricole Pôle 4 s'inscrivent activement dans cette dynamique. À cet effet, le 15 et 16 octobre 2020, s'est tenue dans la salle de conférence de l'ATDA Pôle 4 à Parakou une cérémonie de célébration de la Journée internationale de la femme rurale édition 2020. Cette journée a pour objectif de définir les modalités de mise en œuvre d'une stratégie de renforcement du leadership et d'une résilience plus accrue des femmes dans les différentes activités de développement socio-économique.
Dans la plupart des décisions, ces femmes-là ne bénéficient pas des avantages qui sont liés au développement économique de chaque pays. Donc, pour les valoriser davantage, la communauté internationale a dédié la journée du 15 octobre pour les célébrer. Comme nous sommes en partenariat avec des programmes, ils ont décidé de nous accompagner pour pouvoir célébrer l'événement au niveau local. Ces femmes-là sont aussi présentes surtout au niveau du maillon transformation. C'est pourquoi nous leur avons demandé de ne pas venir seulement pour écouter les discours, mais qu'elles viennent avec leur chef-d'œuvre pour qu'on puisse voir ce qu'elles font et les gens vont aussi profiter pour se ravitailler.
En effet, dans sa stratégie de renforcement des capacités des acteurs de la filière cajou, TechnoServe, à travers Bénin Cajou, fournit des assistances techniques spécifiques et appropriées à la satisfaction des besoins des partenaires du public et du privé afin de promouvoir la production des noix brutes d'anacarde, le développement des chaînes de valeur et l'amélioration des revenus, notamment ceux des femmes.
Les braves femmes rurales sont effectivement à l'honneur aujourd'hui. Nous les félicitons et nous les exhortons à mettre leur résilience au service de nos communautés, surtout en cette période de pandémie. Et nous voulons les rassurer du soutien de TechnoServe pour une plus grande intégration du genre dans les chaînes de valeur de la filière anacarde.
Rappelons qu'au cours de cette messe agricole et rurale de haute facture, diverses autorités ont accompagné l'ATDA et TechnoServe à accélérer les meilleures innovations des produits dérivés du cajou et renforcer les aptitudes des femmes leaders et résilientes dans la filière cajou. Aussi faut-il le souligner, l'ambiance a été motivante et festive, marquée par 2 temps forts, portant notamment sur les réflexions et les partages d'expériences sur la résilience des femmes dans la chaîne de valeur anacarde et l'exposition vente des meilleures innovations réussies en faveur des femmes dans le développement socio-économique.
C'est grâce à Bénin Cajou que ça a été organisé dans le Nord, précisément à Parakou. Et ça a permis aux femmes des 2 Nord de participer. Je veux dire à Takora Donga, Bongo, Albori, Zoukoline, le centre aussi. Voilà pourquoi je tiens à remercier très sincèrement Bénin Cajou. Et cette séance aujourd'hui nous permet, elle nous a permis de partager les expériences des autres femmes. C'est déjà un plus pour nous. Et pour nous qui sommes arrivés, je nous demande à notre retour de passer l'information à celles qui ne sont pas venues, pour qu'elles puissent aussi être informées de ce que nous sommes venus faire. C'est ce qui manque souvent. Et ça fait que les informations, nous les gardons et les autres n'ont plus d'informations aussi. Ça ne permet pas un développement du groupe. Donc je nous demande de souvent communiquer, de partager l'information avec les autres femmes aussi de nos groupes.
Notons que dans la vision de travailler pour une véritable accélération et intégration de la filière cajou au Bénin, avec une part conséquente pour les femmes, l'intégration du genre constitue l'un des principaux axes d'intervention de TechnoServe via le projet Bénin Cajou.
Le projet Bénin Cashew a inscrit dans ses priorités, à compter de l'année 2019, des activités pour la sensibilisation des acteurs en vue d'une meilleure prise en compte de l'intégration du genre dans les différents maillons de la production. C'est à ce titre qu'après avoir milité en amont par un plaidoyer auprès de la FENAPAB pour l'amendement des textes en faveur d'une plus grande intégration du genre, Bénin Cashew a soutenu en aval le processus de renouvellement des organes de gestion de la FENAPAB, qui s'est achevé le 23 septembre 2019 avec l'élection à sa tête d'une femme, Madame Saadatou Atta Kakayachi, en tant que présidente du conseil d'administration.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes, surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Mariée et mère de 3 enfants, Madame Saadatou est propriétaire de 5 plantations d'anacardiers de 7 hectares et demi à Pénésoulou dans la commune de Bassila, à 372 km de Cotonou. Entrée dans la production du cajou depuis 1998 et précédemment chef quartier, cette mère dévouée gère en subsidiaire son restaurant, son commerce de savon et mène des œuvres sociales en faveur des orphelins de son arrondissement. Brave et vaillante, elle exhorte son équipe et les femmes dans la filière cajou à se battre pour pousser loin la filière.
Pour réussir ma mission, c'est un engagement efficace de l'équipe. Ensuite aussi, il y a la disponibilité que toutes les femmes adhèrent aux coopératives de leur localité, entretenir bien les champs disponibles, celles qui n'en ont pas encore n'ont qu'à produire et surtout faire la vente groupée.
Le directeur général de la Fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin, FENAPAB, explique ici les raisons qui ont soutenu cette action d'éclat manifestée par l'élection d'une femme à la présidence du conseil d'administration de la FENAPAB.
Depuis la création de la FENAPAB en 2006, elle a été gérée par les hommes. Déjà en septembre 2019, les hommes et les femmes ont souhaité mettre maintenant les femmes à la tête de cette organisation pour gérer ces 2 organes-là, conseil d'administration et conseil de surveillance.
La commune de Bassila n'est pas restée en marge de ce processus car la mairie s'est illustrée récemment dans des actes forts en faveur des femmes pour la filière cajou.
Il faut dire que c'est un honneur pour nous et une fierté de savoir que une dame de ma commune, à la personne de Madame Atta Kakayachi Sada, a été élue. C'est en même temps un défi pour nous.
Avec ce coup d'éclat, Madame Atta, présidente de la FENAPAB, élue pour 3 ans depuis le 23 septembre 2019, expose ici succinctement un plan de sa vision pour la filière cajou qui ne peut évidemment pas se réaliser sans le précieux concours des autorités en charge de l'agriculture au Bénin.
Actuellement, nous sommes à 130 000 tonnes. Mon souhait est qu'on fasse le double, sinon même pourquoi pas le triple du tonnage antérieur et ensuite qu'on puisse transformer plus de la moitié de ces produits au niveau local chez nous pour le plein essor de cette filière. Les activités à mener, c'est de continuer le plaidoyer envers le public, les privés, dans le renforcement des capacités.
Cashew is an increasingly important crop for the countries in West Africa. For Benin, it's their second most valuable export, and we saw this big potential to grow and increase more.
Le cajou arrive en seconde place après le coton. À 110 000, 120 000 tonnes, en 2 ans, nous sommes passés à 120, 130, 140 000 tonnes. L'objectif du gouvernement, c'est d'aller à 300 000 tonnes à la fin du quinquennat.
Cashew me permet de vivre. Au moment où je n'avais pas suivi avec Cashew Bénin, les 2 hectares font 5 sacs. Et maintenant, avec Cashew Bénin, je vends 15 sacs cette année. Le projet nous a appris beaucoup de choses.
Il a formé 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et 1 homme.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Benin Cashew is an innovative program aimed at strengthening and growing the Beninese cashew sector. Its goal is to create a more productive, competitive, sustainable, and inclusive economic growth engine for the people of Benin. It's being funded by the USDA and is being implemented by TechnoServe and our partners at CRS. Over 8 years, Benin Cashew will increase the yields and incomes of more than 49,000 smallholder farmers, triple Benin's domestic processing capacity, create more than 3,400 jobs, most of which will be held by women, and will position the entire sector for continued growth long after the project ends.
TechnoServe travaille avec des hommes et des femmes pour bâtir des fermes et des entreprises compétitives qui contribuent à la réduction de la pauvreté, à l'augmentation de la résilience des bénéficiaires et de leur communauté. Nous restons convaincus que la participation pleine et entière des femmes et des filles permet de maximiser la croissance économique inclusive pour un développement généralisé. Au sein de la production agricole et notamment dans la filière cajou, bien que présentes, les femmes sont confrontées à des difficultés en ce qui concerne l'accès aux facteurs de production, notamment la terre, les ressources financières, la technologie et les formations. Au début du projet Benin Cashew, la participation des femmes était d'environ 20,57%. À fin décembre 2020, ce taux est passé à 34,67% au sein de la production et à 39% au sein du projet. L'objectif étant d'atteindre au moins 40% de participation des femmes. Pour atteindre ce résultat, nous avons mis en place un dispositif institutionnel avec tous les partenaires du projet pour intégrer le genre au sein de toutes les activités de ce projet. Nous avons un dispositif basé sur des points focaux genre qui ont reçu des formations sur différentes techniques, différentes thématiques. Nous avons mené aussi un plaidoyer pour la modification des tests statutaires des fêtières des producteurs de cajou afin d'alléger les conditions d'accès des femmes aux coopératives. Et nous avons pu avoir une femme présidente du conseil d'administration de la fêtière des producteurs d'anacarde et une femme présidente du conseil de surveillance de cette même organisation, ce qui est une première au Bénin au sein de la filière anacarde.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes, surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer
imported from Africa. So sustainability is a big issue. Question is, will Vietnam process less to a higher value, perhaps maintaining the value of its exports, but reducing the volume? And if that happens, what's the impact of that on growing countries in Africa? Secondly, we'll have a look at Vietnam's neighbor, Cambodia. So Cambodia introduced its cashew sector policy this year. I think it was the 23rd of January it was introduced. We can see, just looking at production, we can see this something of a miracle in production in Cambodia, where production steeply rose and now has started to decline. There was a loss of area. Earlier I mentioned that farmers can make pretty good decisions at times. Well, it looks like some Cambodian farmers made quite a good decision when they decided that some of the marginal areas planted to cashews would be planted to something else. Possibly fruit, and fruit's been a big growing business in Cambodia too. So we've seen production come back down, and seems that we may see further growth, but we won't see this number in 2021 again for some time. And this brings some major issues for other producing countries. And I'm just reproducing a slide here, which was used in a presentation in Cambodia earlier this year. And we looked at some of the areas. We will focus in on that a little. So what does the rise of Cambodia mean for other producing countries? Well, it changes the buying pattern for raw cashew nuts. It means that processors in Vietnam have a large supply, this year somewhere around about 700,000 tons, early in the year. So they'll be buying later in Africa. They'll be buying higher quality in Cambodia so they can afford maybe to focus on price a little bit more in Africa, which means lower prices for RCN. A greater need to store product because buyers come later. And we've seen this in the last 2 years, where buyers have come that little bit later. And as a result, infrastructure is more important. Otherwise, quality will decline. For India, there is an opportunity now to buy cashews in Cambodia. And probably, again, as we may have seen this year, less competition in markets that Indian processors favor for supply, like Ghana, like Benin. And for Indonesia, it means reduced interest, reduced demand, and lower prices. So we are seeing, since Cambodia has arrived on the scene in big volume, we're seeing that raw cashew nut prices have become somewhat compressed. So the difference from the lower quality to the top quality is less than it used to be. Buying early in the season is less, particularly from Vietnam. And the interest in quality from Vietnam has eased a little bit because Cambodian raw cashew nuts generally are high quality material. So the policy in Cambodia introduced this year is targeting, first of all, productivity. So they're targeting an increase in productivity by 25% by 2027. I would be surprised if they made that. I don't think production will rise in the next 3 or 4 years by 25%. We may have good years, we may have bad years, but I don't think we'll see a sustained increase like that. Possibly more realizable is a 50% increase in production by 2032. So if Cambodians are successful, if Cambodian policy is well executed, then we will see increased production in Cambodia. 50% increase would bring Cambodian production higher than Côte d'Ivoire. Hard to see it, looking at it today. But then again, if we looked at Cambodia 10 years ago and talked about 700,000 tons, we would have said that was hard to see too. Second pillar of the policy is industrialization. That means investment in processing development. That's quite likely to meet with some success. Maybe not for 100% of the crop, but significant, I think, as time goes on. And we are already seeing some good processing plants in place in Cambodia. And the policy then focuses on stimulating exports and facilitating trade. What's missing? Well, they're not focusing on regulating farm gate prices. They're looking to support growers with improved productivity. So improved productivity means improved yields. It also probably, in this case, means increasing the area planted to cashews. But this is dynamic because it depends on demand for other products. And they're focusing on export and trade facilitation. So a lot of the typical things that are done in African countries are not being done in Cambodia. We're not seeing as deep a level of policy development or regulation as we're seeing in some countries in West Africa. Now, maybe that doesn't need to happen, or maybe that's the reason, or maybe they're just taking a more, what would we say, more liberal approach to the management of the sector. In general, we can see that Cambodia intends to become an exporter of cashew kernels. Cambodia intends to become a bigger producer of cashew kernels. Now, big question about all of this where are the resources coming from to do this? And if you look at the situation today, it's quite difficult to see how productivity can be increased based on the available resources. It's quite difficult to see where industrialization would come from beyond maybe that first 100,000 tons of processing, which is going to happen, I'm pretty sure. But after that, what would bring investors in? You've always got this problem of competition from Vietnam, highly efficient processors, literally a day's drive away from most production. But to put it in business terms, about $80 per ton away for raw cashew nuts compared to maybe $300 per ton away in West Africa. So still difficult issues, but certainly policy development. Tanzania has seen really interesting developments in policy. And we're seeing this year a very successful auction so far. Back in April, we had this article where we had a minister talking about stopping the export of unprocessed or raw cashew nuts and developing processing. Big statements. And we have seen some interesting policy developments in Tanzania. So on the one hand, we've definitely seen more realistic RCN marketing, pricing. That's why cashews, 110,000 tons is moving this year. We are seeing some promotion of processing, and we are seeing a key factor, in my opinion, that processors are now allowed to buy from the local cooperatives, farmer groups. That makes a huge difference. They don't have to buy through the auction. They may if they wish, but they don't have to buy through the auction. So it eliminates a lot of cost for processors, and it eliminates some of the competition with the export market. Really good move, in my opinion, and seems to be having some impact on processing projects. Change is certainly needed. But, and now I'm looking at this article back in April, there's not going to be the kind of processing capacity in the time frame required to consider banning the export of raw cashew nuts by 2025, 2026. The budget proposed absolutely ineffective. 10 billion Tanzanian shillings. That's not going to build a processing industry. Completely inadequate. And here we see a key failure of policy. And that is setting unrealistic goals. So the reaction of many people to such announcements, we're going to ban the export of raw cashew nuts by 25, 26. That means we're going to have 100% processing. These are unrealistic goals. Unrealistic goals, unrealistic budget, unrealistic idea. If you say, we're going to do this and it's going to take 10 years, that's maybe realistic. So this underlines one of the key problems with policy and regulation right across the world in cashews. The politics gets in the way of the reality. Maybe you say that happens everywhere, and maybe it does. But it damages the sector. So people look at it and say they're still dreaming. It doesn't make sense. With those kind of ideas, it's not an attractive investment. And I think these kind of unrealistic goals have a hugely detrimental effect on the profile of the sector, the risk profile, and the attractiveness of the sector to investors and financial institutions. To some, cashews still looks like the Wild West. Let's have a look at Ghana. So in 2023, we've seen some significant developments in policy in Ghana. And we're seeing some really interesting conversations going on there. So Ghana is somewhat unique. The cashew sector in Ghana, like a lot of the economy, is pretty open. The country has good ports, and cashew nuts flow into Ghana from surrounding countries for export through the ports of Tema and Takoradi. They also flow from Cote d'Ivoire which is illegal on the Ivorian side of the equation, although it's not illegal in Ghana, and that product comes in. So Ghana has unique aspects to deal with in its transition. And we look at things like its competitive advantages. So quite an attractive business environment to work in. Good quality cashew nuts grow in Ghana. There is production, significant production of good quality cashews, and also access to material from landlocked countries which must flow to the ports. Challenges are using the competitive advantages, preserving the quality and the identity of the domestic production in literally a sea of product coming in from so many different countries. Managing this transit trade, as you can see, the black arrows are the formal trade and the red maybe informal trade. You can see it happens on a number of borders. Also managing the border area production. And this is a key issue. I was lucky enough to have some discussions with TCDA on this issue, and you can just see how complex this is. And we were talking about where the border is, product grows on one side, it grows on the other. It should flow one way logically in terms of markets, but because of a political border, then by law, it's supposed to flow the other way. So this whole idea of managing border trade, and it's not only Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, as I'll come to it again in a minute, is a really key area when we talk about policy. And what we're seeing in 2023 in Ghana is efforts to come to a way to manage these major issues. The last one being supporting value addition, as is common in most countries. So Ghana, despite its production, despite its huge throughput of raw cashew nuts in transit, processing production has declined hugely in the last 10 years for a whole range of reasons. But nonetheless, I think Ghana is about to make something of a comeback in processing. And this is the challenge that faces the policymakers and the regulatory bodies in Ghana. If you want a complicated story, the Sagabi, Senegal, the Gambia, and Guinea-Bissau, and we can add in the Republic of Guinea too. But if you want a complicated cashew story, this is it. I was in this region back in September and October, and I was working with the Lift Cashew Project, which is a USDA project implemented by Shelter for Life, and we had some very interesting discussions. So you can see that policy and regulation is a major area for discussion in this region, in all three countries, perhaps in all four countries. And if you look at the map, you can see why. So you have informal trade between the countries, that's those orange arrows, and you can see this extends Cote d'Ivoire into Guinea, Guinea-Bissau into Guinea, Guinea-Bissau into Senegal, Senegal into the Gambia, and really complex setup. You have ports, 4 major ports in the region, some of them competitive, some of them highly uncompetitive. You have maybe 75, somewhere between 75 and 90,000 tons flowing from Guinea-Bissau into Senegal, from Senegal to the port of Dakar for export on to India and Vietnam. It used to flow into the port of Banjul in the Gambia, no longer. You have options. You have a truck route with a huge carbon footprint, or you have a coaster and barge route by sea from Ziguinchor in Senegal to Dakar. So in this area, you get this really complex pattern of trade. And it arises from differences in policy. So a huge difference in policy. Guinea-Bissau, highly regulated cashew country. Senegal doesn't really have a strong regulation of the cashew sector. There are the normal rules of business, but few regulations specifically put in place for the cashew sector. Senegal is a new and up-and-coming producer. Guinea-Bissau is a long-time established producer. You have differences in taxation, and that's part of the reason for the flow of informal trade. High level of cost, high level of taxation on export from Guinea-Bissau, no export tax in the Senegal, although there are high costs still because you look at this movement of product to the port of Dakar. And those differences give rise to the informal trade. Other factor which sometimes is neglected is to notice that Guinea-Bissau as a country is highly dependent on cashew nuts and cashew nut exports, whereas Senegal or the Gambia, it's a much lower profile industry in terms of its impact on the national economy. All of these factors have given rise to an imbalance in policies, a complete lack of harmonization, even within the framework of ECOWAS trade agreements, and generates higher costs. So we have, in any case, quite high export costs from Bissau, quite high export costs from Senegal, a little bit less from the Gambia. Who pays these costs? Yeah, you got it. Farmers pay these costs. There's no processor in India or Vietnam offering to pay a higher price because the cost of trucking is higher. This is the market, and it pays the market price. So who pays the higher costs? Effectively, the farmers in each country pay the highest cost. And this is where policy needs to be reviewed. So fortunately, in 2023, we're seeing this at last being discussed thanks to the work of this project, the Lift Cashew project in West Africa. So I've been looking at some examples: Vietnam, Cambodia, Tanzania, Ghana, and Sagabi for developments in 2023. There were also some developments in Mozambique where we saw some quite realistic pricing developing on the farm gate. We saw some changes in the taxation of the export of Burma kernels, which was agreed by the entire sector. If you were with us 4 weeks ago, you will have heard that. And we saw some other developments there. We've seen some developments in India, but nothing major, more or less repositioning rather than changes in policy. It's quite a dynamic sector in this area. And like I said, 42% of the world's cashews are grown in countries with high regulation. But let's now go to Olivier, and let's talk to Olivier about the largest producer in the world, Côte d'Ivoire, and see what he's got to tell us on the developments in 2023 on policy there. Olivier, good morning. Good morning, Olivier. Can you hear us?
Hello. Good morning, Jim.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing fine. Thank you.
Great. You're very welcome. It's good to...
I had some struggles to connect, but I'm on it now.
Well, I'm glad you made it. What's been happening in Côte d'Ivoire on cashew policy and regulation in 2023? I know you at Pro Cashew are very interested in this subject. I know you've done some great work on it. What's the situation during this year?
Okay. Good morning, everyone, once again. And thank you for the opportunity given to join on this forum. Indeed, Pro Cashew has been working sometime now on policy regulations in 5 countries in West Africa, such like Benin, Burkina Faso, Ghana, indeed Côte d'Ivoire, and then also Nigeria. Specifically, what concerns Côte d'Ivoire in 2023, let's say that first of all, Côte d'Ivoire has been implementing policy regulations through their National Development and Regulation Authority. And there have been a lot in terms of policy that have been implemented so far. Talking about 2023, I may say that there have not been specific new policies that have been created or established. As far as I'm concerned, there have been more enforcement and control to what is existing already, and mostly the issue of pricing at the farmer level, which has really suffered since some years now. And I think this year was a tough one, where it has been very difficult to make sure farmers are accessing to the minimum price fixed by the government. So therefore, we have seen different strategies that has been put in place by Côte d'Ivoire, especially to make sure that the farmer will access to the minimum price. And those were actions like putting in place a kind of organization that they call like GIE, and this organization, this group of people were supposed to, buy directly from farmers the nuts at a minimum price, which is funds that have been put in place by the country itself, let's say by the CCA, to make sure that at least they can absorb a maximum quantity of the nuts from the farmers to avoid them suffering from this price fluctuation due to the too much availability of nuts. But also we can say now with the situation of countries like Cambodia, etc., quality issue is also affecting. Apart from this enforcement and control of pricing, I may say that there have been also some, let's say, initiatives to conduct or to support this enforcement. Lastly, Côte d'Ivoire has organized studies and also some workshops, consultative workshops with stakeholders, and that was not only to work on access to planting material, but that was also to enforce the pricing issue. So that workshop studies was mainly to determine the minimum price cost of production of 1 kilogram of RCN. And I think that is somehow a way also to enforce this law and on a better basis to make sure that the farmer will really, as a business or as a professional in production, should at least ensure, cover his expenses while producing cashew.
So let me ask you about that, Olivier, if I may. So are we talking then about a situation where the minimum price is calculated on the one hand on a kind of a cost plus basis for the farmer?
Yes, I think that is the idea behind.
That's interesting.
Yes, it was really a welcome move because right now I think most countries like Benin also try to figure out this minimum price based on production cost of farmers, but really this is always based on country level, so it's difficult to spread it on other West African countries. So for now, this is very specific, but it's very needed to make sure that farmer is not, just virtually losing while investing into a cashew farm and then selling the nuts at a loss. So I can say that is a very good move.
It's not easy though, is it? I mean,
so apart from that, I think most of Yes.
Sorry, Olivier, I was just thinking it's quite difficult to estimate cost because you're often dealing with things like family labor. You're dealing with, what's a reasonable payback period on planting a tree? a lot of these different factors, yield, and varying yield across the country. Have they looked at all those different factors? Have they set a standard as to how they're going to look at cost yet?
Indeed, it is good that you are bringing it. That study also works on costing the price of improved material seedling. And then, yes, I agree with you that is something that may not be done overnight, because when we want to put this kind of metrics, it needs to be tied to really well thought and also accurate data that can go with the material that has been planted, and goes with even good agricultural practices that should be somehow standard in a way that it should be applied also to the quality material. And we also know that cashew from one year to the other, specifically from the beginning, it takes some years before it reaches to the optimum production yield in the farm. So that will make me say that it's a good move for now, but it could take some time to adjust and get the good metrics that can really allow to generalize this kind of studies, and even the economics around the cashew production.
Interesting. Are there any developments this year in the regulation or policy with relation to processing in Côte d'Ivoire?
In relation with processing, I could say that this has really been the move of Côte d'Ivoire to support processing. Local processors with subsidies like 400 CFA subsidy given to processors based on every kernel produced and exported from the country. And this has been really a game changer for Côte d'Ivoire as moving into processing, as we have seen that during these past years, Côte d'Ivoire really positioned himself even as a third processor of RCN in the world. Even though it's not much as compared to the two first, it's already very good. It's a very good move. It's a very good information. And then this is still going on. We can observe that there are many processing factories that are coming in, even from Vietnam, to join the infrastructures that Côte d'Ivoire has established, like the economic zone, agricultural economic zones specific for cashew. I think they have planned to open at least 3 big zones like that. The one in Korogo has been opened like 2-3 months ago. I mean, that was right after the African Cashew Alliance conference in Senegal. We've seen big processors, big players like from Vietnam, where we hear that the biggest processor of RCN in Vietnam is establishing in Côte d'Ivoire. And I think this is also, we can count this as a good progress in terms of policy implementation for processing in Côte d'Ivoire.
So it has been certainly hugely successful, the policies so far. I wonder how long the subsidies can continue. You know, there must be factories now that are receiving subsidies for 4 or 5 years. Is there any change at this time of changes in policy toward factories that have been receiving a subsidy for 3 or 4 or 5 years?
Sure, Jim, and this is really a question mark that is being we've been asking to ourselves, in the industry. There are many factors. I can say that, for instance, this subsidy, for instance, is based on ASEAN, taxes that it has been taken on ASEAN, for instance, to support that place. One question is, how do the farmer also benefit from the tax that has been taken on ASEAN, because it's from production? So farmers are asking themselves, okay, so what can be done strictly for us at the economic level so that we can also make sure that, yes, we are benefiting from this ASEAN export tax. But anyway, the support for the policy should be spread all over the value chain, and processing is one of let's say the segment that really needs to be developed to ensure that locally the entire value chain can be strong enough to absorb and also to build on a good kind of economy to ensure stability of the ASEAN costs from farm gate to the other value chain actors. So yes, we realized that with this subsidy, factories established in Cote d'Ivoire benefiting from this subsidy are able to catch up quickly. Instead of 8 years or more, within 4 years, 5 years already, those ones can really stabilize and get up and running, as from information and studies we have seen. And the question is, up to when should we continue subsidizing?
Exactly.
And why? So there have been some thoughts around it. One thinking is, okay, now that farmers also need to be taken care of, and we still need to have this link between local processors. Indeed, it could be an idea that these subsidies, instead of benefiting directly to the processing factory, these subsidies can move through the processing factories to the farmers in terms of enforcing the linkages between farmer and processor, but also farmer benefiting from support and assistance in terms of good agricultural practices, training that comes directly from processor to the farmer, which is will continue to enforce the link between those two entities, instead of, for instance, just deciding to enforce farmers good agricultural practices directly. It could be good that this could go through the processing factories to ensure not only, because factory will be much more interested into getting as much quantity as they need, but also as much quality that they need. So this funding can shift, instead of being directly supporting the factories now, but it could go through the farmer so that it can enforce the supply chain between farmers and processors.
Right.
I mean, these are ideas that are being taught around this issue.
Well, it's an interesting idea. I mean, you would normally expect that when a processor is in place, that the farmer would benefit by better treatment, by some forms of support, and possibly better prices. The visibility of that depends on whether the minimum farm gate price is set realistically. And it also depends on, if you take a scenario in 2023, for example, imagine in Cote d'Ivoire, if there were no processors, the farm gate price would have been much lower. Sure. That's my opinion. But can we identify that in terms of numbers? And I think that's one of the big challenges, is to demonstrate the effectiveness of the farm gate price, its impact on farmers, its impact on processors, and to demonstrate the value and the supply chain linkage importance between processors and farmers. And we know by looking at it that not all processors have developed linkages to farmers. Olivier, stay with us. We're going to move on a little bit. We've got to keep to our schedule. stay with us for some questions. But for now, thanks very much indeed. It's been very interesting listening to the developments in Côte d'Ivoire, even in a year where not a lot seemed to be happening in the country. There were quite a few developments on policy and regulation. Thanks, Olivier.
Thank you.
Let's just see if we can move on a little and try and summarize the environment generally in the cashew policy area. And I break it into three things. So at the moment, we're in a period of structural change. So we've seen the production shift to West Africa. We've seen Vietnam concentrate on low-cost models of processing. We've seen effectively, on the one hand, the commoditization of raw cashew nuts and the decommoditization of cashew kernels. And this is one of the reasons we get this strain in terms of, as processors tell us, the parity between RCN and cashew kernels. So this structural change has been going on for some time. It has dynamic consequences, and this is where policymakers really struggle. And this is where in 2023 we've seen real difficulty for regulators and policymakers in enforcement. We have the changing supply-demand balance. So we had a whole range of policy and regulation in West Africa formulated, evolved over about 10 years. And then along comes Cambodia and upsets the whole thing by becoming a massive producer in a period of 5 years. We have changes, less right now, but over the last 10 years, quite a lot in the processing technology. We've seen changes due to rationalization of processing in Vietnam and maybe a change of emphasis there. So there's a lot of dynamic factors impacting at a time of structural change. And this leaves processors with some real challenges. And when we looked at it, again, I worked with the Pro Cashew project for which Olivier works, and we found a lot of different factors began to come into play. And we looked particularly at impacts on increasing regulation. And we spotted consequences of policy and regulation that were unintended. We saw policy that became reactive. So policies that see something in the market, they react to that. 12 months on, it's completely changed. These dynamic factors have changed it, but the policy remains in place. And key things like an absence of information. So overall, the volatile environment for policy making and regulation continued. And I suppose we could say, in some cases, governments, regulators responded and started to assess it. And I think Olivier has been telling us the story of Côte d'Ivoire, where we see a reassessment of how the minimum price is calculated. That makes sense. But elsewhere, we've seen reactions that probably 12 months from now will look a little bit ill thought out. Let's ban the export of RCN. Let's make sure that all our borders are closed. These kind of things often don't work. So we're looking at a period of challenge, and let's look forward. We've been looking back. Let's look forward, and let's look for some of the challenges in regulation. And regulation and policy, let me say it again, is going to have an impact. More than 40% of the world's cashews grow in highly regulated sectors. The challenges for 2024. So we're now in November, and it's a good time to be looking at next year, looking at policy next year. If you're in business, looking at the impact on your business. If you're a policymaker, what are the next steps? If you're a development agency, how do you support these factors? Challenges will be continued good market information and understanding that market information. There will be the continued challenges of the unintended consequences, putting a regulation in place, maybe a price, maybe a farm gate price. What are the consequences of that? What does that mean in the long term? What does it mean in the short term? Stakeholder consultation. And this varies widely. In some countries, we see stakeholders very well consulted. They get an opportunity to talk to the regulators. In others, we see virtually none. In some, we see a kind of a lip service, as we would say, paid to stakeholders' views, where they hear the view, but they still do whatever they were going to do in the first place. That often happens, and that's often based on political expediency. What do we do? Well, when's the next election? This is a fact of life everywhere. There are still a lot of outdated, inaccurate preconceptions. I spoke to someone last week, a roaster in a major Western country. And this guy continues to tell me that, Jim, you can never process in Africa. And I'm going, well, you're so wrong. It's already happening. But he had preconceptions based on ideas that were 10, 15 years out of date. That's one example, but there are others. A lot of the ideas behind our cashew regulation in some countries are based on outmoded conceptions of the market, outmoded ideas in terms of how the market works. Fix it by listening to stakeholders. This is kind of a personal thing, but the unrealistic goal setting I find totally destructive. You know, we're going to process 100% of our raw cashews by the end of next year. It's not going to happen. It's not possible that it would happen. And all it does is damage the profile of the sector nationally, internationally, with financial institutions, with investors. And it demoralizes stakeholders too. Now, if the government thinks so poorly about the sector that they can say these things just for the sake of a headline, well, what chance have any of us got? And I think one of the key things, and this would be something for organizations that are set the task of managing and regulating the sector, is that they're often under-resourced. They're often under-trained, under-supported. They lack data systems. They lack access to the resources that they need. And that means that sometimes decision-making is based on poor process or poor information. Those are some of the challenges that I think we'll face in policy and regulation in 2024. What we have seen and what we've been talking about is quite a dynamic aspect of the cashew sector, where in the last 15 years, we've seen huge changes in policy. We've seen huge changes in regulation. And now, as Olivier was telling us, we're beginning to see activity in enforcement and a reassessment of some of the practices, hopefully for the better. And we may well see the evidence of that in 2024. Thank you for listening. Let's go to Blessing and see what questions Blessing has for us. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. Indeed, we do have some questions here, which I'm going to start reading notes. The first question is, what progress has been made to facilitate and ensure trade among countries? If no, what is hindering this?
Wow, okay. Well, there has been progress. There's been a lot of discussion. There's been a lot of efforts to regulate cross-border trade. I guess we're talking now about road traffic trade. I think that probably we talked about increasing regulation, we talked about increasing and more developed policies, and we talked about a lack of harmonization. So the key issue is the lack of harmonization. Lack of different policies in different countries, different tax rates are important, and that causes particularly informal cross-border trade to happen. On the other hand, you have basic infrastructure issues, cost issues. So if we look at a particular location and we ask ourselves, where would the logical place for that product, particularly raw cashew nuts, for that product to go to be exported? And it may be that the logical port of export from a cost point of view and a time point of view might happen to be in another country. And that happens, and that often happens informally. So there have been ideas to close borders, but largely the idea of closing borders to trade in West Africa particularly has failed because it's so incredibly difficult to enforce that. And that's perfectly understandable. And maybe there's evidence in some countries that governments have accepted that and said, look, maybe it goes across the border, maybe we lose the tax revenue, but at least the farmers are getting a better price. So one of the key issues for me is harmonization, and the other key issue is cost, so that product flows to its most logical destination, and that's a discussion amongst governments. What's hindering it? Well, the scale of the problem, the politics, differences between countries, the fact that we have cashews in some countries are not important, in other countries, maybe bordering those countries, cashews are extremely important. So the governments may take a view in one country, I will do something to change the cashew sector, to improve it, but their neighbors may say, well, it's really not worth it because, this product is not that important to us. And these are issues that are hindering it. I think there is another key issue that we should mention, and that is in many cases, the scale and volume of this trade has not been well identified. So studies in that area, I mentioned the work by the Lift Cashew project in Sagabi, and that's one of the projects that's seeking to identify exactly what this trade means and the volume of it in that area. But we see it in a lot of areas, and it's often driven by overambitious policy. It's often driven by the unintended consequences of policy. In the long run, cross-border trade between countries tends to stop as processing is developed. Ultimately, if you're processing locally, you've no need for cross-border trade. In the meantime, there's a big challenge harmonizing policies to, at least to a level that you can enforce the regulation. Huge differences between countries make it really hard. And I think that 2024, we're going to see not less of this kind of trade, but probably more. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. I have a follow-up question to the one that I just asked. It says, have initiatives like ECOWAS, AFTA, CICC, and other treaties or agreements made any difference in cashew trade among countries?
Sorry, Blessing, could you repeat that?
Have initiatives like ECOWAS, AFTA, CICC, and other treaties or agreements made any difference in cashew trade among countries?
I would say no right now, but I think that that's an evolving process. And I think as countries more openly discuss their policy and their different needs, that those organizations could have an impact. As of now, I don't really see that. What we are seeing is an increase in cross-border trade. Let's just say it again, cross-border trade of itself is not a problem. It's when it becomes informal or smuggled trade, then it becomes a problem, because that has big impact. It can have consequences for farm gate prices in one country compared to another. It can have impact on the confidence of investors. It can have an impact on the reputation of the business in general. Blessing.
Thank you, Jim. The next question goes like this. If there is a struggle to enforce minimum prices in West Africa, what then can we say has been the role of associations, interprofessions, and governments to remedy or avoid these situations?
Well, there is a struggle, clearly. I think the role of interprofessions and associations has been relatively limited in this, but I do think that that's evolving. I think one of the key things in managing this kind of trade is that interprofessions in the various neighbouring countries would have communication and would seek to work out how trade between the countries can happen within the law with data, and then try to influence governments to try and organize trade as logically as possible. No one wants to see farm gate prices fall, because that will not only impact the incomes of smallholder families, but it will also eventually decrease production. It will also eventually increase costs for government to support those people. So it's a very, very sensitive issue. And it needs, in my opinion, it needs the engagement of farmers, farmer representatives, interprofessions and associations with governments cross borders to talk together and to try and work out the best way to manage this kind of trade. At the end of the day, what happens is that farmers in one country get a higher price because of this trade. But that may mean that farmers in the neighboring country receive a lower price. How do you balance that? And that's a really difficult one to tackle. And so far, I won't say ineffective, but let's say limited in terms of the role of associations and interprofessions, because probably what we're going through right now is a questioning of whether or not this should happen and an identification of the problem. Next step is to gather the data and to come up with some solutions. Maybe Olivier has some thoughts on that. The role, Olivier, we're talking about the role of associations and interprofessions to remedy the cross-border trade. Have you any thoughts on that?
Okay, Jim, thank you. Yeah, if I could maybe give some ideas about what is going on. I mean, thinking of that from the question I have heard, as I can say that this is work in progress. It's work in progress in the sense that we have seen some collaborations going on from one country interprofessions to others. And while we are still struggling even at the national level to ensure a certain stability in pricing, that is already a trigger or a difficult to even make sure that we can harmonize SaaS pricing from one country to another at a farm gate level. And this is a reality. I think already countries are trying to make it, and they are not always successful, I can say, from what we have seen, even though we know that there is an impact on pricing when they apply these kind of things. But one example I can talk about here is the collaboration between the OIA, which is the interprofession in Côte d'Ivoire, and IFA, the interprofession in Benin. Since the last CICC ministerial meeting in Côte d'Ivoire, there has been a lot of initiatives between these two organizations that have started, of course, before. And during that CICC meeting, there have been collaboration between those two business association has been improved, and they even went to sign an MOU. And the idea behind is to share experience in stabilizing or ensuring the minimum a good price for the farmer. So, and that was going into the direction of group sales and quality in terms of gap at the farm gate level, at least to make sure that farmer can market his products in groups and then also guarantee a kind of good pricing. So this is an activity that is going on, and there has been some exchanges visits between those two institutions from one country to another to see how they have been organized in terms of setting the price or in terms of making sure the farmer will get a good price at the farm gate level. But harmonizing for now is not, I mean, really the move, because already these experiences in making sure that the price could be stabilized, or the farmer will get a good price at the farm gate level, are the discussions that are going on right now. And I think this is the same thing for even at government level, policies level, to see how farmer can ensure a better price, and also this can be spread at the sub-regional level.
Okay, thanks, Olivier. Let's we're running out of time. Let's go back to Blessing and see what other questions we've got. Let's work our way through these fairly quickly. Blessing.
Thank you very much. The next question says, do you think the targets from Cambodia are realistic? What factors from the country can make this possible? And is it something countries in Africa can learn from?
Okay, well, quick answer to it. If anything we have learned from the last 6 or so years about Cambodia is not to underestimate the ability of Cambodia to increase its production. We've seen it on cashews, we've seen it on fruit. So I think that the targets are extremely ambitious. I think that the first target, 25% by 2027, is probably not realistic, but the second one is possible. The factors that can make this possible are good prices for raw cashew nuts, which haven't been around for the past couple of years, as you know. The resilience of the existing tree variety. So we've got a lot of young trees of this new hybrid variety. And how resistant are they to extremes of weather? That's the second factor. The third factor is, of course, the weather and climate change impact on the weather in Cambodia. Ambitious, yes. Realistic in the longer period to 2032, probably. In the shorter period, no. What can African countries learn? I think firstly, the value of good research, good development of hybrid varieties by the private sector, not supported by the government in that case, is a real lesson. Secondly, that farmers make pretty good decisions and that they know what they're doing. Support them, train them, and you generally get quite a good result. I think that one of the key lessons, which perhaps doesn't still need to be learned, but nonetheless is there, is that processing has a huge impact. In Cambodia's case, it's processing in their neighboring country of Vietnam. In Africa, it's processing locally. So I think that it would be very interesting to build links between Cambodia and West African producing countries to exchange those lessons. There's much in common. Back to you, Blessing.
Thank you very much, Tim. I have two questions which I would merge. The first one is one is asking for an overview of cashew processing in Africa. And then the follow-up question is, why is local consumption of these processed cashews very low in West Africa?
Why is local consumption low? Because for many years there wasn't enough processing. The product was quite a high price. There's no long-term culture of snacking in that style. Cashews were not regarded as a food. There were also a lot of myths and traditions around the consumption of cashew nuts, which are probably not true. So there's a whole bunch of reasons, but I think the key one is if you don't have processing, you can't really have local consumption. So cashews was regarded as something that would be sold. Now we're seeing development of local consumption. We're seeing it supported, and I would expect that it would rise. But make no mistake, this product is a high-cost product. If we think of the cost of foods, cashews is not amongst the cheaper foods. So it would be interesting and I think important that processors find ways to produce cashew products that are accessible to local consumers at all levels of the economy. And it's not just a product for the wealthier people. So that's a snapshot. A brief overview of value addition on African cashew products. So we're talking about cashew kernels. We're talking about cashew nut shell liquid. We're talking about the use of those byproducts. Value addition also extends to secondary processing, roasting, salting, and perhaps ultimately consumer packs. what we're seeing is fast growth. If we look at value addition generally, we're seeing fast growth in Cote d'Ivoire. We've seen fast growth in Nigeria, maybe taking a little bit of a knockback this year. We're seeing growth in virtually every country, but at different paces. So it's been slow in Tanzania, it's been slow in Ghana, it's been fast in Cote d'Ivoire and in Nigeria. And sometimes it's interesting to look at the differences between countries. So in Cote d'Ivoire, we see huge government support, including, as Olivier mentioned, subsidies, direct subsidies for processors. In Nigeria, we don't see anything like that. There is support for investment in agriculture, there's support for export, but compared to other countries in cashew, it's relatively light. But we are getting strong development in Nigeria, and perhaps that's also linked to a large urban population and a domestic market. We should also consider, when we think about value addition, that the whole post-harvest area and the development of the supply chain. You can add a lot of value in cashews by drying, storing, packing, preparing properly, as well as growing and processing. And the emphasis, and maybe this is something that we think of policy and regulation in general terms, and we should focus in on, is that the tendency has been to focus on production and processing. And maybe now that those are developing quite well in many countries, what we need to focus on is the organization of the sector and the linkages between the various elements of the sector, particularly, and this really refers to Olivier's point on farm gate prices, to the discussion on informal trade, to the discussion on local consumption, but a real emphasis on that linkage between processors and farmers. And in that sense, sector organization is probably one of the key issues looking forward to 2024 and beyond in the cashew sector. Any other questions, Blessing?
Yes, we do have a last question. The question is, why is it that African-owned companies find it difficult to access international markets with RCN without partnering with traders or buyers abroad? It's often finance.
It's often that the foreign partners bring the finance for the deal. I think that's probably the key factor. So people are able to source the raw cashew nuts, but they don't have the money to pay for them. They're able to source the raw cashew nuts, but they don't have the money to bag, dry, prepare for export, and to finance the export operations. I think there also is, in general terms, something of a marketing gap in the cashew sector in Africa, and that applies to kernels and raw cashew nuts, so that to a certain extent, exporters find it difficult to connect. Now, one thing we should always remember here is that the international trade in raw cashew nuts is dominated by groups of traders. It's what I described many years ago now as a trader-driven chain. And that means that it's quite difficult to bypass that and access processors at the other end if that's what you want to do, although that is possible. So the large trading companies, whilst they facilitate a huge trade, and it is a huge trade now and it needs a lot of money, they also act as, let's say, a barrier, although not necessarily negatively, between the African-owned company and the ultimate customer for the raw cashew nuts in India or in Vietnam. That's an interesting question, and it's something that could take a very long answer, but I haven't got the time to do that right now.
Thank you very much, Jim. Just before we bring the session to an end, what should we be looking out for in the period between now and the next journey?
Well, I think over the next 2 weeks, we're going to see some feedback on the overall situation and demand in India. Post Diwali, we'll see, Diwali was last Sunday, the main day was last Sunday, and we're going to see some feedback on that, how it went. We might see some activity in the raw cashew nut market as a result, or maybe not. That's number one. We should also keep a close eye on the weather developments in Southeast Asia, particularly as we get closer to critical periods in the growing of the crop in Cambodia and in Vietnam. I don't think we're going to see huge activity on cashew kernels in terms of price volatility, but I think we will see continued buying. but that will calm down a little bit toward the end of the month as American buyers look forward to their big holiday, the Thanksgiving holiday, towards the end of November. So we may see a quieter period then. And we probably should also keep a good eye on development in Tanzania. Overall, I don't expect put it like this, I don't expect any fireworks in the next 2 weeks. I think it'll be a relatively calm period, but it could be also a period that gives us some pointers to what's going to happen in 2024. So let me conclude by thanking Olivier Cabré, Olivier from the Pro Cashew Project. Thank you, Olivier, for your contribution, for your very interesting thoughts. And I look forward to seeing you again one of these days. Thanks to everyone for attending. Thanks to our interpreters, and blessing. Thanks to you. I will look forward to talking again in 2 weeks on the 29th of November. And we're going to take about an hour and a half then to have a look back on the cashew market in 2023, what's happened, why it happened, and what that means for what lies ahead in 2024. See you then. Thanks very much for now, and thank you, Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim, and also to our speaker that joined us today, Olivier Cabré, and of course to the technical team behind the scene. As Jim mentioned, we are looking forward to having you join us again on the 29th of November. And until then, we say do take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.